I'm Pep Philpott. We begin in Wasaga Beach, Ontario. Hundreds of people defied provincial pandemic restrictions, gathering at the town north of Toronto for an unauthorized car show this weekend. Ontario Provincial Police closed the town of about 20,000 to non-residents over COVID-19 concerns. Police moved in last night, forcing anyone who didn't live there to leave. The provincial government in Ontario is trying to enforce tighter COVID restrictions. A ban on large gatherings is one of them. Now, while many countries are reimposing strict measures to deal with growing coronavirus infections, it's a very different situation in Australia. The state of Victoria is easing COVID restrictions as the number of cases there continues on a downward trend. Stephanie Skandaris has more from Melbourne.
It's some small steps out of lockdown, but they're positive ones that were announced by Victoria's Premier today. The biggest one, no more curfew as of midnight. That curfew was at 8 p.m., then it got moved to 9 p.m., now it's gone. Another biggie, public gatherings. Victorians can now get together outside, either just with their household or 5 people from 2 households. Now, that's a big step because previously you could only be outside for exercise or if you were on your way to grocery shop or go to work or seek medical care, and only for 2 hours. Also announced today, 127,000 workers can go back in certain jobs. There is some return to school for younger kids. Childcare is now open for all kids. And all of this is happening either on schedule or ahead of schedule. And that's because Victoria has been so successful in bringing its cases down. There were just 16 today.
That's Stephanie Skandaris in Melbourne, Australia. Massachusetts Democratic Senator Elizabeth Warren is slamming U.S. President Donald Trump.
Americans don't like to be cheated, and we've been cheated big time.
She says the president's rush to have Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett installed before the November 3rd election is unconstitutional. In a video posted to Twitter, Warren urged her supporters to keep fighting the nomination.
Right now, Trump and McConnell are trying to break our democracy, and it's going to take all of us to rebuild it.
Republicans, though, are hailing Trump's choice and saying that Barrett should be sworn in without delay. Here's House Minority Leader Kevin McCarthy.
There is no question that Amy Coney Barrett is the best qualified person to uphold the Constitution. The Senate should confirm her quickly.
The confirmation hearing for Barrett is expected to begin on October 12th. A U.S. court is expected to rule today on whether TikTok can be banned from app stores. The Trump administration moved to block the Chinese-owned video sharing app in the U.S. over national security concerns. There's a deal in place for California-based Oracle and retail giant Walmart to buy part of TikTok. But as it stands now, a government order would severely restrict the app in the U.S. as of midnight tonight. And as of today, the Canada Emergency Response Benefit is ending. Replacing it is an expanded employment insurance program. Hannah Thibodeau has more on the transition between these support programs.
If you've been getting benefits through Service Canada, you will be transitioned right to EI. But if you've been receiving the CERB through the Canada Revenue Agency, you're going to have to apply for EI through Service Canada. The Canada Recovery Benefit covers gig workers, and it previously paid $400 a week, but that amount is now bumped up to $500 a week. If you can't work because you're caring for dependents, there is a $500 per week Canada Recovery Caregiving Benefit. There is a third option, and it's called the Canada Recovery Sickness Benefit. So if you get sick from COVID-19 or you're self-isolating because of symptoms and you don't have sick leave benefits from your employer, there is up to $500 per week for you. Hannah Thibodeau, CBC News, Yarmouth, Nova Scotia.
And that is your World This Hour for CBC News. I'm Pep Philpott.
From CTV News at 7:56 a.m. today.
Hello, I'm Andrea Bain from the CTV Newsroom in Toronto. Here are the top stories. Quebec reported nearly 700 new cases of COVID-19 on Saturday. The province saw 698 cases, its biggest single-day increase since May. Meantime, Ontario reported 435 new cases, with just under 2/3 of the new cases in people under the age of 40. And police in Portland arrested several people overnight after they declared the city's latest anti-racism protest illegal. Earlier in the day, the group calling itself the Proud Boys held a rally in support of President Donald Trump. They were met by counter-protesters, but there was no widespread violence. And Republicans are hoping for a swift confirmation for U.S. President Donald Trump's choice to replace the late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. On Saturday, Trump announced he was nominating Judge Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. The GOP is hoping to lock in conservative gains on the High Court before the November 3rd election. And Canada's Jamal Murray's dream of hoisting the Larry O'Brien Trophy will have to wait another year. Murray and the Denver Nuggets were eliminated from their Western Conference final by the Los Angeles Lakers 117-107. For all the day's top stories and breaking news as it happens, tune to CTV News Channel or go online to ctvnews.ca. I'm Andrea Bain.
From CNBC Tech Check at 5:01 p.m. last Friday.
I'm Josh Lipton with your CNBC Tech Check. An App Store reversal. Facebook has struck a deal with Apple over transaction for its online event business. Online event fees will be processed through Facebook Pay without Apple collecting its typical 30% cut of sales. The agreement runs through the end of 2020, but does not apply to gaming companies hosting paid events. Facebook said Apple had previously blocked an update to the Facebook app that displayed a message saying Apple would take a cut of the transactions. Meanwhile, Amazon has unveiled two new Fire TV products. The Fire Stick and Fire Stick Lite are priced at $40 and $30 and will compete with streaming devices from Roku and Apple. The e-commerce giant also debuted a new Ring security camera that's fixed on top of a flying drone. It's meant to fly through your house when you aren't home and record footage. Users determine the flight path. It locks into a dock that blocks the camera when charging. The device launches next year with a price tag of $250. And looking ahead, the IPO wave will roll on next week. Data software company Palantir is going public via direct listing, planned for next Wednesday. The Wall Street Journal is reporting shares could debut at around $10 a piece, signaling a valuation of $22 billion. Earlier this week, Palantir said it expects revenue to grow 42% in 2020 versus last year to more than $1 billion. The company was founded back in 2003, but it has still yet to post a profit. That's the news from the West Coast. We'll see you back here on Monday.
From DW News Brief at 9 a.m. today.
This is DW News, and these are our top stories. Clashes have erupted between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the disputed region of Nagorno-Karabakh. Both sides reported casualties and accused the other of starting the hostilities. Armenia responded by declaring martial law. The conflict over the ethnic Armenian enclave in Azerbaijan has been intensifying since a flare-up in July left 16 people dead. Forces in Belarus have arrested dozens of women protesting against authoritarian leader Alexander Lukashenko. The march in the capital Minsk came just days after Lukashenko was sworn into a sixth term at a secretive inauguration. Public anger against his grip on power has been simmering since his re-election last month in a vote that's been widely condemned as rigged. U.S. President Donald Trump has nominated Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. She would replace the late Ruth Bader Ginsburg. Her confirmation would likely tilt the court further in favor of conservative causes. The Republican-controlled Senate is likely to confirm her ahead of the U.S. election on November 3rd. This is DW News from Berlin. Follow us on Twitter and Instagram at DW News or visit our website, dw.com.
From Bloomberg First Word at 12:37 a.m. today.
A federal judge has scheduled a rare Sunday morning hearing to decide if the U.S. can go through with its ban on the popular video sharing app TikTok. Owner ByteDance has asked the court to block the ban on constitutional free speech grounds, even as it pursues approvals for its deals with Oracle and Walmart. The ban is set to begin tonight.
The US has reportedly sanctioned China's largest chip maker, SMIC. The Financial Times is reporting that US companies will now need a license to export certain products. to the firm due to the unacceptable risk that the goods could be used for military purposes. SMIC says it has not received an official notice of sanctions.
Thousands of maskless demonstrators have taken to the streets of central London to protest against the government's expanded anti-coronavirus restrictions, sparking clashes with police. Protesters threw bottles at police, who used their batons and left some with visible injuries. The UK reported a record 6,874 COVID cases on Friday. Some lawmakers have criticized the government for implementing new rules without parliamentary approval.
And Lebanon's Prime Minister-designate Mustafa Adib has stepped down after failing to form a government, leaving the nation rudderless as it struggles to recover from a devastating explosion at its main port last month. Adib was tapped to form a government after the previous coalition resigned following the blast. He quit on Saturday after meeting with President Michel Aoun near the capital in Beirut.
And I will be right back, guys.
Were unanswered at the time, but Tessa joined us again this morning because we had some big developments this week.
We got an answer on Wednesday.
The Jefferson County Grand Jury charges as follows.
Out of the 3 officers who fired their weapons at Brianna Taylor's apartment back in March, only one of them has been indicted. And that was former Louisville detective Brett Hankison.
Count 1. Wanton endangerment in the first degree.
That's a Class D felony that can carry between 1 and 5 years in prison.
Count 2. Wanton endangerment in the first degree.
But as the judge was reading the counts...
Count 3. Wanton endangerment in the first degree.
She was saying the initials of the residents who were endangered by these shots.
He wantonly shot a gun into the apartment occupied by initials C.E.
And none of those initials, we noticed pretty quickly, were B.T. for Brianna Taylor.
Occupied by initials C.N.
Or K.W. for Kenny Walker.
Occupied by initials Z.F.
So we figured out that while there were these 3 counts of wanton endangerment, they weren't actually for endangering Brianna. They were for shots that endangered her neighbors.
So the grand jury didn't find any wrongdoing with how the police approached Brianna Taylor and her boyfriend, but they did find that the police recklessly endangered the lives of Brianna Taylor's neighbors.
Yes. So when Attorney General Daniel Cameron, who is in his first term in office, spoke about this, he explained that
our investigation showed, and the grand jury agreed, that Mattingly and Cosgrove were justified in the return of deadly fire after having been fired upon by Kenneth Walker.
That self-defense response didn't play out with Brett Hankison to the same degree because he was not firing from that doorway.
Detective Hankinson fired his weapon from a outside sliding glass door and through a bedroom window.
That's why he was fired from the police department over the summer, and that's why he's facing these reckless endangerment charges.
Some bullets traveled through apartment 4 and into apartment 3.
A neighboring apartment behind her.
3 residents of apartment 3 were at home, including a male, a pregnant female, and a child.
So that's why he's facing charges, and the other 2 officers aren't.
Just so I can make sure I had this clear, the Attorney General said that this one officer, Detective Hankinson, who was further away, he wasn't firing in self-defense, but the other 2 officers were.
Essentially, yes. He said that
according to Kentucky law, the use of force by Mattingly and Cosgrove was justified to protect themselves.
Because these officers were, in his opinion, acting in self-defense, that homicide charges shouldn't apply here.
This justification bars us from pursuing criminal charges in Miss Brianna Taylor's death.
How many shots did the cops fire in total? Do we know?
We knew that Brett Hankison was accused of firing 10 rounds blindly from outside the apartment, and Attorney General Daniel Cameron said that he fired 10 times in total. So that's 6 from Mattingly, 10 from Hankison. And then we also learned that Detective Cosgrove fired a total of 16 times. So more than 30 shots in total from these 3 officers were fired into Brianna Taylor's apartment, with several of them going into an apartment next to hers and an apartment upstairs.
And how many shots were fired by Brianna Taylor's boyfriend, Kenneth Walker, to set off this firefight?
Kenneth Walker fired 1 shot.
Yeah. The last time we spoke, we spent a lot of time focused on the no-knock warrant that had been issued to these police officers. Have we learned anything more there?
So we know from court records that police sought and were given a warrant with a no-knock clause on it. Sergeant Mattingly, based on the testimony that we had heard he had given to investigators, he says that they are saying, police, come to the door, police, search warrant.
Banged on the door, no response. Banged on it again, no response. At that point, we started announcing ourselves, please come to the door. Please, we have a search warrant.
Based on Kenneth Walker's statements that he gave to police, he said they heard a knocking, they heard this pounding, but they had no idea who it was from inside the apartment.
So it's a loud boom at the door. First thing she said was, "Who is it?" No response. So we like, what the heck? We both get up, start putting on clothes. Another knock at the door. She's like, "Who is it?" Loud at the top of her lungs. No response.
You know, that sets up a discrepancy. You know, did Kenneth Walker know he was firing at police when this all began and triggered this series of events? Daniel Cameron said definitively that
evidence shows that officers both knocked and announced their presence at the apartment.
He reached that conclusion based on statements made by the officers and one neighbor.
In other words, the warrant was not served as a no-knock warrant.
That has not sat well with a lot of people.
Taylor's family attorney, Ben Crump, says that's not true.
Everybody there said they never heard the police identify themselves.
Journalists from local to national have, been all over that apartment complex talking to neighbors, and the neighbors are saying, we didn't hear anything. We didn't know it was police. They've even talked to neighbors who said, well, we called the police when we heard the shooting. We didn't know the shooting was the police. And so, attorneys for Brianna's family and journalists are confused as to why one neighbor and his statements carry more weight than, 10 plus other neighbors who did not hear police.
How does this verdict gel with the settlement that Brianna Taylor's family received, I think, last week?
What we heard from the Attorney General and the grand jury on Wednesday is the result of a criminal investigation. But last week, we saw Brianna Taylor's family and attorneys announce alongside city leaders that they had resolved a civil lawsuit for the wrongful death of Brianna Taylor. That was huge. It was a $12 million settlement, which is the largest police payout in Louisville history, but it's also one of the largest for a police shooting in the nation. But, protesters look at this $12 million settlement and they say, one, her family deserves every single cent of that and more. And people say, why is the city paying $12 million if those officers didn't do anything wrong?
And of course, protesters have been calling for criminal charges against these officers in the death of Brianna Taylor for months now. Does this indictment mean that will never happen?
There is still a federal investigation surrounding Brianna Taylor's death, and The FBI is looking into how the warrant was obtained, what happened that night. They're looking for civil rights violations. So it's not over yet, even though, obviously, like you said, protesters are really unhappy about this. You know, the rallying cry, the commentary from celebrities, the t-shirts, the memes, the slogan.
Tyler Hero scored in double figures every game this postseason.
He's been putting in work for a young fella. But it'd also be a great day to arrest the cops that murdered Brianna Taylor.
It's all been arrest the cops who killed Brianna Taylor.
Arrest the cops! Arrest the cops!
And Daniel Cameron made it very clear that that's not going to happen. That's not, wanton endangerment was the charge they were going to go with for one officer.
What was the reaction in Louisville after this verdict came down on Wednesday?
There's a lot of grief. There are people who are mourning. There are also people who are mad as hell. Who feel like this is just another example of police getting away with killing a black person. And so, we did see protests the last couple of nights. The city is under a curfew. The National Guard is here. And on Wednesday night, 2 officers were shot while, out working the protests.
I'm Robert Schroeder, Chief of Police, Louisville Metro Police Department. At about 8:30 tonight, our officers were called to the area of Brooklyn College. Shots rang out, and 2 of our officers were shot. Both officers are currently undergoing treatment at University Hospital. One is in alert and stable. The other officer is currently undergoing surgery and stable.
Thankfully, their injuries were not life-threatening, and, they're both expected to recover. But it's really like the city is undergoing this collective trauma.
How has Brianna Taylor's family responded?
I spoke to Brianna Taylor's family attorneys yesterday who recounted the moment that Tamika Palmer learned that no one was being charged for her daughter's death. And both attorneys I spoke to just described it as her just, immediately just breaking down, just falling apart, that, she couldn't speak. The attorneys have consistently been raising the point of how can you endanger the neighbors but not endanger Brianna? That's what they can't make sense of, and that's what they're mad about. This is absolutely not what Brianna Taylor's family wanted to hear. They were very clear from the get-go that they wanted officers held criminally responsible for Brianna Taylor's death, and they didn't get that.
More in a minute. I'm Sean Ramaspuram. It's Today Explained. And you can listen. Fabiola Sinius, you report on race here at Vox. Tell me, the Justice for Brianna Taylor movement, what exactly did that movement mean by justice? What did people want to see?
Yeah, I think what's been fascinating about the movement for Brianna Taylor's life and the movement for justice for Brianna Taylor over the past couple months is that it meant very different things to different people. So there were some people who were saying, arrest the cops who killed Brianna Taylor, right? For them, justice was seeing Brett Hankinson being taken away in handcuffs and seeing the other 2 officers who also fired their guns that night be taken away in handcuffs. But then there were some people who were like, justice doesn't mean seeking retribution, seeking punishment within the current system as it stands. So people were saying, actually, we need to stop centering Brianna Taylor in this, and we actually need to see how this is just part of a bigger movement to say there's so much more work to be done in the criminal justice system, whether that's reforming it, defunding the police, or just abolishing the system altogether.
So it ran the gamut from actually put these cops in handcuffs to get rid of cops altogether, but was anyone out there clamoring for a, wanton endangerment charge for just one of the police officers?
Absolutely not. I don't think that anyone got what they were looking for in this situation. But I think that maybe some people were more shocked than others, right? So the people who were actually still looking for the system to produce some kind of justice were shocked and confused, whereas the people who are already divested from it were like, this is what we expected. So, for example, since March 13th, according to the Washington Post's police tracker, more than 80 black people have been killed at the hands of police. And a study from the Mapping Police Violence database found that 99% of killings by police between the years of 2013 and 2019 haven't even resulted in officers being charged with a crime. So this happens a lot, and it's pretty rare for police officers to be charged.
Has there been justice in other cases that have gotten a lot of attention this summer, like George Floyd or Jacob Blake or Rayshard Brooks?
Yeah, I'd say in the case of George Floyd, where a white officer from Minneapolis basically kneeled on his neck, he got charged with third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter. And in the cases of Rayshard Brooks and Jacob Blake, who were also shot by police this summer, we don't have any decisions yet, but historically speaking, I don't know that it would make a lot of sense for protesters to look forward to justice in those cases either.
Where has the discussion in this country about abolishing the police or defunding the police left off? I mean, there were a lot of initial promises and pledges and reforms after the death of George Floyd, but now, I mean, the most conspicuous conversation that seems to be happening around it is the president trying to say Joe Biden wants to abolish the police, and Joe Biden saying, actually, no, I don't.
I'd say in the beginning we saw a lot of attention on the Black Lives Matter movement. We saw public opinion shift, right? So many Americans are now saying that they believe that racism is a problem in America. They believe that funds should be taken away from police and given to other essential community services like social workers, mental health care workers. When we're starting to look at what's happening at individual police departments, we aren't seeing much movement on the defund front. So, for example, in Louisville, where Brianna Taylor was killed, activists who were calling for the defunding of police, they have not seen any wins on that front. We have seen, like, the Louisville Metro Council ban no-knock warrants, and we also saw the Kentucky Attorney General say that he's going to launch a task force following this decision to basically investigate the way that warrants are applied for and the way in which they're executed. And that's something that people are saying is not enough. We also saw with a $12 million settlement that Louisville announced before the grand jury's decision a list of police reforms that they wanted to begin to put into action, and those included, giving police officers credits for living in low-income neighborhoods or encouraging police officers to do community service, but those are just so far from the funding that activists are calling for.
And outside Kentucky, outside Louisville?
And outside Louisville, I'd say the movement is just about the same, right? We've seen, like, some school districts, for example, in Portland and their contracts with police departments. We've seen, like in Rochester, the mayor, following the killing of Daniel Prude or the release of that video, say that she failed the city and she's going to start an effort to basically reallocate funding to social workers who can basically help police officers who get calls related to mental health. New York State's Attorney General is now making a decision about when to publicly release body camera footage in the case of police-involved deaths. Daniel Prude died on March 23rd, but footage of his killing wasn't released until months later.
So it sounds like what we ended up with is a patchwork of police reforms across the country. We didn't have a sort of national police reform reimagination. We just had sort of cities that have issues with police violence against black people second-guessing and reconsidering their policies. Is that fair?
That's definitely fair to say, especially when we look at, you mentioned Joe Biden before. His plan is to actually, increase funding to police because he believes that, one of the strongest avenues to fixing policing is community policing, right? Police being out on the streets, having positive interactions with civilians. But the movement is definitely far from over because I think this year we just started just saying things that have never been said so casually in public, right? This year we see people saying systemic racism exists. We see people saying that we need to rethink policing, and I think that the fact that these terms, these phrases are just entering people's vocabulary means that this is only a start. Brianna Taylor's death also shows us that Black women especially don't receive justice under the American criminal justice system. One of Brianna Taylor's attorneys, Ben Crump, from the very beginning, basically highlighted the fact that Brianna Taylor's case got more attention because people saw the death of George Floyd and rallied around that. And so her name basically jumped into popular discussions following the death of George Floyd. I also think this moment just shows that the system is working the way that it was designed. No officers were indicted in her killing. Brett Hankinson's indictment was for the fact that he shot through the walls and the bullets went through Brianna Taylor's apartment and into her neighbor's apartment. So his indictment, again, just had nothing to do with the fact that Brianna Taylor was shot dead in her apartment.
You can read Fabiola's writing on Brianna Taylor's case at Vox.com. Tessa Duvall has a newsletter dedicated to Brianna Taylor's case. You can find it over at the Courier-Journal's website. You can also find a link to it over at Today Explained on Twitter. We are at Today_Explained. We go for the day. One last reminder that support for the show today comes from Who We Are. It's a new podcast from Ben and Jerry.
One last reminder from me. Fuck with ads, because ads are fucking stupid. Guys, we did it. Listen to the news. Did our yoga very, very fucking lazily, but we did our yoga. And we listened to a whole episode of Today Explained, and we did it all while high. All we need now is an affirmation. To write this email to my client, or not to write this email to my client. Noodle, don't noodle. Be too worried about what once was and not what will be. However, there's a saying. Yesterday's history. Tomorrow's a mystery. But today is a gift. That is why they call it the present. Guys, thank you so much for joining Fernando Gomez. And don't fucking up and Drick shit. I'll read your name later. Thank you so much for joining. I'll talk to y'all when I see y'all.